be able to understand all of them, but I'm not one of them, unfortunately. So, Monsieur le Professeur, après vous.
Merci. Donc je parlerai français, donc désolé. Because my English is, I hate it, my English. Alors, deux séries de réflexions. Une première série sur ce que c'est qu'un film documentaire, et ce film-là, et une deuxième.
Więc chciałbym się podzielić uwagę. I would like to share comments. I would like to share my comments and reflections, my thoughts concerning the film as a kind of documentary, and on another note concerning the principle of interpretation behind this documentary, which would be a kind of more serious reflection. So the production of a documentary follows a different logic than the quest for knowledge. So it's different from scientific research. A documentary film has to compromise a lot. The requirements of film production, the requirements of the author of the film script, and then he relies on a historian who also may make errors, and compromise is also made with the television chain, which has the courage to present the film, but sometimes it requires almost acrobatic compromises in order to get the film broadcast. And it's not a matter of censorship. Representatives of Arte broadcaster were uncomfortable with the unpleasant way the filmmakers treated Lenin, which has this image of a hero, of a heroic figure. Other examples of compromise, that is, points where I had to give way to the other side. For example, Napoleon, a revolutionary who was against Lenin, he considered that Lenin had betrayed revolutionary and the Bolsheviks betrayed revolutionary principles when taking power, and this had to be eliminated. And Lenin's Testament. I wasn't interested in the detailed notes of Lenin concerning different revolutionary leaders, but the point is that it documents not only the fact that Lenin was kind of controlling all the details of the revolution, and especially what followed after taking power, which doesn't imply that he did not bear any responsibility. But the official image, the official Soviet image of a communist leader, broadly speaking, differed from the image of the opponents of Lenin, of his adversaries. When we talk about the revolution of 1917, they were largely on the side of historic realities. I can share an anecdote, perhaps, but I mustn't exaggerate, because then there wouldn't be enough time, unfortunately, for other speakers. So, just an anecdote. One of the Soviet time films used in the documentary I want to comment. There is a journalist who is writing with a typewriter, reporting the February demonstrations. And in one of the films I have read it, that at the call of the great Lenin, the workers invade the streets of St. Petersburg. I also regret that some aspects which were not mitigated by arte. And I just would like to explain that once again that this documentary does not reflect scientific knowledge. The opening of the Soviet Congress of the 25th. Why? Maybe someone here remembers, because I did test that person's capacity to pay attention. So, during the October Soviet Congress, Martov, who was one of the left-wing Bolshevik leaders, puts forward a motion, a resolution, saying that the Congress of the Soviets would take power on behalf of all the parties, including the Mensheviks. And you remember what happens. The resolution is adopted unanimously. The Bolsheviks don't dare to vote against. And then when information comes from the streets that Mensheviks are protesting against arrests, then they recede. So Trotsky is in opposition at this point to this declaration, removing to the waste of history their opposition. So in this film, this scene, at the time, of course, was not filmed. Maybe two other things which I regret are not in the film. For example, there is the figure of Sergeant Linde, who between February and October is one of the key revolutionaries. And his role was perhaps at some stage more important than all the leadership of the Bolsheviks, and yet he has disappeared from history books. Yet he was very important. Still in April, but then a lot of other figures emerge. I also would like to recall an episode from July 1917, when Kerensky, who was prime minister at the time, and Yekaterina Baryshkova comes to the prime minister's office, pleading on her knees to Prime Minister Kerensky to immediately arrest the Bolsheviks responsible, the leaders of the Bolsheviks who were holding the party conference in Petersburg, and Kerensky refuses, even though everybody knew where the conference was taking place. But Kerensky, like many other leaders of other parties represented at the Diet at the Soviet, didn't want to do that. He didn't want to, at that point in time, to eliminate the Bolshevik party from the game. There was a kind of brotherhood across party lines between the revolutionaries. So, and the last point, reflection on the film. It's a documentary concerning the revolution of 1917, which is difficult. It is difficult to present in cinema, in movie pictures, in a cinematographic form. But still, it's not a bad idea to do it. But the difficulty was that it wasn't my idea, my choice, but the idea to follow Sukhanov's narrative, who was a Menshevik militant. And that's an excellent idea for the way of presenting the film. And I was touched by the fact that Sukhanov actually wrote the first account as a direct witness of both revolutions of February and October. But of course he didn't have access to every piece of information, and he couldn't be everywhere at the same time, so there are a number of errors in his account. For example, I couldn't catch everything, but things that I didn't see or didn't know. The president of the Soviet before Trotsky, who was Menshevik and not a revolutionary socialist. So the portrait of Antonovchenko was replaced by Sverdlov. When I compared the two portraits, they are very similar, extremely similar one to the other. And then the Finnish guard. Lenin arrives, and there aren't these pedestals there and so on. But at this point already one had to kind of take a kind of reserve with regards to Lenin. So the idea was to go away with the traditional imagery. We will have an opportunity to discuss this aspect later, but this idea to effectively show that Lenin, even in October, was kind of moved around by history rather than being in charge of what was going on. Was a bit like a puppet of history. And in the background, what I tried to show in this film, despite all the compromises, reference to my concepts which I developed through critical reflection on the march of history. First point. As a matter of principle, the result, the outcome, and the starting point of a critical key process of the revolution. And its outcome, its result, in no case is a matter, when we talk of revolutions of 1917, is in no way similar to what happened in Poland quite recently. Or nothing, it has nothing in common with the Iranian revolution, for example. So the result is absolutely not a reflection or an explanatory key for the processes which led to the final outcome. In other words, the worst thing in terms of our knowledge, trying to rationalize and explain what happened, the process, the key process which took place. The worst error is to take the outcome as the starting point for reflection. But once the result, the outcome is there, then it leads very frequently to a kind of agent causing events and people's fate. But of course historians and social scientists often fall in the trap of retroactive thinking and transforming what had happened and claiming or explaining it as a historical necessity, as if only one radical solution were possible, as in this case. My method is to put the result kind of in brackets, to put it in the fridge. And this implies a different approach. It implies using the jargon of theory of knowledge that you need a different explicandum, a different means of explanation. And it's not easy to find the explanation why the outcome was what it was rather than being different. But we are often trapped in this illusion that the outcome was a matter of necessity. And of course I haven't fully succeeded in my exercise, but the result, the outcome of this critical process So it's not the outcome, but the historical process as its origin. So the process as such, what happens in the course of a process, has a certain line, a certain direction, but it's not contained in the historical conditions of its origin. In other words, you cannot deduct from the origins what, from the initial, original historical conditions, you can't deduct the causes of the process which is then triggered and leads to a certain trajectory. So it's not, you don't have kind of genes of a process which would lead to a given outcome. So I am against this kind of genetic explanation or the cultural source, which that the cultural roots of a society lead to the emergence of a process. This is also an error, and the course of history is also doesn't have a particular goal, a particular purpose towards which it would lead. So it's not a teleological process leading to a specific target or goal. So in my jargon, this is the historicism as a way of thought about history, the belief that history, starting from the conditions of the emergence of a process, of its birth, in this case a revolutionary process, would necessarily lead to a certain condition afterwards. That's the historicism which Marx put forward with his social classes and so on, and the struggle of the classes. So in Marxist thought, the development of history, it's rather English democracy or American kind of democracy, or the market which rules historical processes. And here Popper and Marx have a similar approach, but the critique of historicism on their part is different than mine. I've tried to reattribute this contingency so as to avoid this temptation to apply historicism. So let's put it in more simple words. There is no law of history or any law of historical development so that from a certain origin we could deduct or explain the development of events or of a process to a particular outcome. So may I elaborate more on this? There is a certain relation between social sciences and history. Historians are in a relationship with social thought, and the point, the game here is not just to present regularities across history, but also to explain them. And a third comment or point. An important number of processes have the following features. They are triggered by their own dynamics or historical conditions of their origin as a kind of etiology. And here again, talking about a critical approach, I recommend this book, like a red book of Mao, as a good guidance. But I would like to explain, in other words, my approach to critical analysis.
Vous serez content?
The interpretation that I've just presented I'm almost concluding. My interpretation of Karl von Clausewitz, this Prussian general, is well known for his following quite trivial suggestion: war, politics, the war is a continuation of politics, and that's a statement takes its full meaning. In my interpretation, what makes him interesting and what he says to us, once the war takes place, once the social and political entities are involved in it, there is no, it doesn't really mean what their purposes are, what their goals are, what their ideologies are. It doesn't really matter what the causes are, the specific causes of this or that war, individual causes of this or that war, because the actors, once the war is in course, they act in the logic of the given very particular situation. And that situation forces them, in their perception, to plan their actions. It also allows violence in its extreme forms. And this weighs on everything that they perpetrate. And the fourth point of my summary, that will not remain without influence on the debate that's going to ensue this evening. Well, perhaps let me formulate it as a question. Namely, what I've just said about this trap of this historicism, of this historical era, whether what I've just said, all that I've just said about the severance of a certain number of historical processes from the conditions, historical, social conditions of their origins and their etiology that makes them meaningful, whether all that is not only meaningful with reference to the critical processes, crises or revolutions, or perhaps is it only correct with reference to short-term processes. And here is where I would like to put a question mark. This is the way I'd like to formulate that thought. And now I'd like to give you the following thought. That I'm only giving you a snippet of the answer. I suspect that this is really not the case. I suspect that this point of view also refers to long-term processes as well, and crises or wars that may occur. And I think that there are great reasons to believe so. And I don't know whether during our debate we will have further opportunities to go back to this thought, but I do believe that we cannot really explain everything with the use of the primary initial conditions and processes, even when we're talking about very, very long-term processes. Thank you very much for your patience.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Professeur, pour ces éclaircissements et ces...
Thank you very much for your reflections and for your explanations that have showed us not only the background of the film, but also provoked more profound reflections about the trajectories of history. We still have a little bit of time for questions.
Yes, well, your English is so much better than my French. Now, we have just a little time for a couple of brief questions to Professor Dobry, and the microphone will be available before we begin the debate. Please raise your hand if you'd like to speak. Well, oh, yes, we have a question. One brave soul.
Good evening, Professor Dobry. Merci pour votre présentation. I will do it. It's more reflection. I was surprised when you said that you were reluctant to use historical screening made to use the historical movies as a basis for your documentary, because vous avez dit que vous n'étiez pas très...
You said that you weren't very enthusiastic about using ancient historical films.
It's the second time I see the documentary. The first time was for the premiere on the French TV, and I found it very innovative compared to the traditional. I mean, we are used to documentaries made in the US with the historian speaking with a black background that tends to bring the cours magistral, to bring the lecturer in the living room. And your documentary is rather like going to the cinema and see a real movie that transmits a different message. So now that you have experience, do you see an added value in using historical films?
Je vais répondre brièvement.
I will very briefly respond. My reluctance was related to the fact that all the Soviet films were apologetic. But we have found a way to distance ourselves from them. Not always to the extent that I would have wished, but it is true that poverty in terms of documentary material in cinematography is true for all these periods, especially in 1917. And I would have been more willing to reach out to these images, but I think that we managed quite well. In fact, the problem, I believe, is that through the use of this type of material, we are experiencing a different type of interpretation. And the problem that I have encountered are, in fact, two other types of work, making a documentary and reflecting upon the historical process. Interpretation, which I cannot control, transits through our... Yes, there are some details. You are correct. And this was very interesting observation indeed.
Merci. J'avais une question sur un autre...
I have a question concerning another point that you have mentioned, which is connected to what I've been dealing with. You said that there is no sense in historicism. There is historicism with the the scholars. Before I came here to this college, it was my perhaps idealistic and perhaps a naive view that despite such events as the Second World War or other events, that there is a certain form of world universal progress. And that despite all the setbacks and the revolutions, this was true. That you don't have to quote people that I have not listed. For example, Germany, from before 1914, or Germany after 1914, were a country, and please forgive this notion, that was a very highly civilized. What I want to say might not appeal to all of you, but that was what I wanted to say about Germany. And now most members of the Russian social democracy were people from before 1917 who never would have found their place in what happened after 1917, even among Bolsheviks. Unfortunately, dare I say, experience tells us that there are reasons to say that. I would like to be a historicist. I'd like to be able to believe in the linear progress, etc., etc. This would be incredibly pleasant.
Le pire est toujours possible, qu'une troisième guerre mondiale n'est.
Do you think it's possible that there might be a third world war? Well, Third World War, I never wanted to be a prophet. I have been reluctant to put forward any of such prophecies, but I have great respect to an American colleague of mine, Robert Merton. His deliberate actions very often trigger effects that have not been intended. It would be so good if the world could be different than that. I don't know whether a third world war will occur or not. Well, however, I do know that living in the Europe of peace, because ever since I was born there hasn't been no war, is frightfully more pleasant than what other generations have experienced in their time. Would that, however, allow me to anticipate the future? I have no idea. And the devil is in the detail, as you will perfectly know. What has ensured peace in Europe? Over this long period of peace in Europe, we seem to be forgetting something that we shouldn't be forgetting. What has ensured peace in Poland, in Europe? In inverted commas, the nuclear balance. I don't think so. There is another factor. There is another factor that would be so important than that, as fear, just blind fear among people, and that is still valid. Let's remember that. What ensures peace in Europe, temporarily, at least for now, let me repeat, is just that challenge. in that snippet of rationality. And the fear that we have towards our colleague Putin, but you will realize that the further we go, the more complicated things get. So there is no certainty that he would be willing to go as far as, of course, he may divide, but to go as far as to devote over a dozen major cities. But you see what we believe in. We believe in a minor thing. We have certain stereotype about a rational approach of this or that individual, and that's a terrible thing to conclude. I cannot respond to the question as to whether or not there will be a third world war. I'm not able to do that. But in applying the terminology, which I hate, based on what type of variables are we reasoning? And that's terrible. Exactly. But it's just not just that. On an intellectual level, historicism is not grounded in the considerations that we have just made. I am under the impression that despite the question that you have put forward, you are probably of a similar opinion as I am. I would like to be as optimistic as you are, but I have no grounds for that, unfortunately.
Sort of only increase the sort of embarrassment of riches. I'm very sorry, but we do now have to move to the next phase of the debate as time is moving. There will be an opportunity to speak a little later on, sir. So if we could now thank Professor Dobry again, and I'd like to invite the four panelists to take places.
Non, c'est ce que j'ai demandé. J'ai pas répondu à votre question.
Ladies and gentlemen, I now have the honor to introduce our distinguished panelists. They are Gayle LONERGAN is a graduate of Cambridge and Oxford universities, specializes in modern history of the 19th and 20th century. She's had several research fellowships in modern history at Oxford, at the National Research University, as well as at the Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg, where she tells me she is still affiliated. And she also teaches at Birkbeck College in the University of London. Serhii PLOKHII is an historian specializing in the history of, well, Ukraine, Eastern Europe, and Cold War studies, and his range goes from the Middle Ages to the present. Since 2007, he's been the Mikhailo Hrushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard University, where he is also the director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Earlier, he was at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, as well as the Ramsey Tompkins Professor of Russian History at the University of Alberta. Nikita PETROV is a Russian historian working for the Memorial Society in Russia. He specializes, rather dangerously perhaps, in the Soviet security services. On the 24th of March 2005, he was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland for his efforts in uncovering the truth against repressions launched against Polish people during the Second World War. His doctorate comes from the University of Amsterdam, and among the places he publishes in is Nowa Gazeta. And Marcel van Herpen is director of the Cicero Foundation, an expert in Russia, Eastern Europe, and post-Soviet states. The author of 3 books on Putin's Russia, which have been translated into several different languages, and he is a frequent contributor to outlets such as Forbes, the National Interest, Project Syndicate, the Moscow Times, Japan Times, and our own New Eastern Europe. So a very warm welcome to you all. The format of the debate is that everyone will have a brief opening statement of 5 minutes, and given the time, I am going to have to ask you to stick to those 5 minutes, reflecting not perhaps only on the film, but also on the legacy of what was being described as a great historical process and its consequences. You will each then have the opportunity to respond to each other before we open it up for comments and questions from the floor. So, if we can go in the same order that I've introduced to, Gayle LONERGAN, may I ask you to start, please?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Michel, for showing us your film. First point is actually reflection. And your particular comment upon the idea of radical solutions that would be available, as if there was only one radical solution, and this radical solution was Lenin and the Bolsheviks. I suppose I would have to reply that it strikes me there were many radical solutions on offer during 1917, which weren't particularly shown there. That always comes down to 2 radical solutions. And the radical solutions are usually, one of which will always be military. And I think that is a common feature of most of these processes. The other one was, of course, a question of a political group that would come over and take over government. And I think you did see that partly in the film when you showed Kerensky. And interestingly enough, and it made me reflect, having the images in front of me, when I saw Kerensky, of course, immediately basically going from a suit into a uniform, it struck me how quickly revolutionaries will don a uniform. For example, my first thought was that Kerensky, but then, of course, you see Trotsky very quickly taking over what becomes the Red Army. He very quickly is in uniform and doesn't like to get rid of it afterwards. And then, of course, most famously, Stalin, who never got rid of his uniform and had various ones designed for him. So my thinking then was, yes, there are radical options. In Russia, it does seem to revolve around these 2. I start to think back again to the 1905, which we call a revolution. But then the big question is that a revolution? Because it didn't actually make any difference so much. And as you can see, the Tsar very quickly pulled everything back as much as he could. But what we forget is that when Serhii Witte came back and was called back into government, he presented the Tsar with 2 options. And the option, one of which we know is the October Manifesto, to try and give the people some form of constitution. But the other option he put on the table, which was a very serious option, was martial law, and basically the military takeover. At the time, it was decided that you could buy off the bourgeoisie, you could say, or you could buy off certain parties by taking the lesser option. Again, there's so many things. This is a problem of history, you're quite right. I started then to go back and think, well, hang on a minute. What about the Decembrists? What about Decabristi? What were they offering? they seem to start offering other alternatives, one of which is a constitutional democracy. The other one is a very radical form of a federal state. They wanted to totally reorganize the administration. I think we could keep on going. And this is then my second reflection, which is upon your comments at the end, which is about the long-term processes. And I'd say here, just as a plea for historians, in a way you've had to take on cultural turns, linguistic turns. We now have to take on everybody else's subject in a way. That, you know, I started to think to myself, well, where do we start? I mean, can we go back? I mean, obviously with the Bolsheviks, we have to go back to the Enlightenment then possibly. We review the Enlightenment. Is it actually a question of a whole process of modernity? All these things historians are constantly grappling with, and modernity, modernization processes, of which, of course, the Bolsheviks is only one. Stalin's basically industrialization drive is simply another attempt at a modernization process. And then it sort of made me then think about your comment about revolutions, how it's not really enough, in a way, to keep calling them and comparing them to comparative studies of revolutions, of which I'm as guilty as any historians. I've done entire courses just on revolution. And actually one thing this is, and maybe it's my own particular trajectory, but my own thing has been the lack of resolution that comes with revolutions. And my own particular concern now, which is upon, in many ways, the lack of resolution that peace treaties bring as well, and the lack of peace treaties, the problems that creates as well, the problem that lack of disagreement creates. My own concern now, for example, in the current political climate, is we need to almost to have another Congress of Vienna to decide where Europe is, where we want Europe to be, and we need to come to some form of agreement, because the end of the Cold War never produced any form of treaty or agreement. And so my own particular concern is not so much on revolutions, and I agree we're probably all guilty of that, but maybe just give us a bit of a break. And I suppose quite where history is going as a discipline is another big question all by itself, I would suggest. Okay.
Thank you very much. You may be consoled to know that my students will be reenacting the Congress of Vienna next month. Now I'd like to ask Serhii PLOKHII to take the microphone, please.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. First of all, it's a fascinating film. I enjoyed it very much, and I thought how much more difficult life for people who produce documentaries is compared to us historians. We are struggling, we are complaining that there is not enough sources, but eventually what is there we can put into our books, into our publications here? It all depends on whether you have visual sources or not, and then you have to dance around that. So, and I think the documentary, in that sense, made amazing things. It's also the documentary that makes you think, and it's the time when it appeared last year. It's the time where there was abundance of books on the Russian Revolution for the first time in 25, 30 years. So the theme, the topics, the subjects were all but forgotten, not only by general public, but also by quite a few historians. And again, it does a good job at rethinking the old mythology. And if I would characterize that documentary with one word, where it puts most emphasis, I would say it's contingency. And it's really asks the question of the way how I understood it, whether revolution produced Lenin or Lenin produced revolution, and it provides a very sophisticated answer pointing in both directions. The rest of my comments will deal with the themes in that documentary that I hope will also help us to continue our discussion as we move into the three Ukrainian revolutions that we'll be discussing through the rest of the conference. So one thing that this film does, it completely misses the imperial turn that emerged in the last 20 or 25 years. So it's understanding of Russian Revolution in a very narrow sense of not just Russian, but also a coup that happened in St. Petersburg, which is fair enough. You can't put the imperial, the nationalities was not a subject of the documentary. It focuses on something else. So it's not there, but there are a lot of elements of those three Ukrainian revolutions that I think are in the documentary. And one of them is the importance really of where the security forces are, where the army is at that given moment in this contention, in this conflict between the old regime and in 1917 we have two old regimes in Russia, the Tsarist regime and then the provisional government, and how the rebels, those who are poised to take power, how they split the army, how they try to turn the army and security forces on their side. And it was shown really very well, and the monarchy falls on the refusal of the army to support it. And by that time, army is already going after the police. There was this extremely interesting episode when a Cossack cuts off the hand of a policeman who is trying to shoot at the crowd. So the police is still there defending the regime, but army is already in revolt. And again, what happens later is the Winter Palace and the storm of the Winter Palace, when there is really very little of a storm and conflict per se. The documentary says it's a police operation. So 20,000 versus 300 people in the palace. Again, that shows you the disposition of forces and the importance of violence and military force in revolutions. Another extremely interesting thing, and that's where St. Petersburg is a ideal place to study those subjects, is the struggle is going over the space in the city, over the buildings. And again, with St. Petersburg divided by Neva and different tributaries, it shows extremely well how important space in the revolution is, and control over the space, and how the marches go, and where they aim, and where they come together. So again, extremely important subject, important not just for the Russian Revolution, but for any kind of revolution. And last but not least, it's the people who are there leading the revolt or trying to lead it. And again, documentary shows this very, very interesting episode when the people from the Soviet are begging the provisional committee of the Duma, please take the power. And they're not prepared to do that. And eventually the Bolsheviks do that on behalf of the Soviets, and Soviets, again, are not prepared to do that. So Lenin, from the very beginning, being a doctrinaire he was, aiming for the world revolution, not for the Russian Revolution, was poised on taking the power. And again, the question of the power is the key issue in every revolution, and that's something that very few people taking part in the revolution understand. Lenin got it, and eventually Lenin got the power. So I will stop here by thanking Professor Dobry and the entire crew that was involved in the production of this documentary, in making me think, and I believe making others think as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for focusing our attention on the location and the achievement of power. Nikita PETROV, please.
Thank you. I want to speak Russian, as you permit me, and thank you very much, because my English is not so good to explain what I want to explain. Thank you. Но прежде всего я хотел бы Прежде всего я хотел бы сказать, что этот фильм, безусловно, о том, что мы продолжаем и будем продолжать еще очень долго.
So I wanted to start with saying that this movie, this film is about the subject which we are going to continue to discuss and probably for quite a long time.
Почему и как большевики взяли власть? Почему погибла империя? Это те вопросы, которые до сих пор волнуют и историков, и в то же время российское общество. И до конца эти вопросы не исследованы и нет на них ответа.
So how and why the Bolsheviks managed to take over the power and how and why the empire collapsed? These are the questions which have not been answered yet and probably will not be in the foreseeable future.
Механизм овладения ситуацией для большевиков была прежде всего пропаганда, и этот вывод для нас актуален до сих пор.
So for the Bolshevik, the main mechanism to take the power and to take the situation or the control over it was the propaganda, and this is something which we have to keep in mind still.
Я не точно цитирую, но примерно мысль Ленина и большевистская мысль заключалась в том, что идея, овладевшая массой, становится движущей силой истории.
So the idea which Lenin proclaimed, it's not maybe not the exact quotation, but he said that the idea which took over the masses, this is something which becomes the engine of the history.
И то, что Ленину и его соратникам удалось в 1917 году, это не просто крушение Российской империи, это попытка создания новой, но теперь уже мировой империи на социалистических, на коммунистических основах.
And the thing which Lenin and his comrades, his group, managed to do in 1917 was not only the breakup, the collapse of the Russian Empire, but also the creation of a new empire, but in this time based on new empire, which would be the world empire, and based on socialist or communist ideology.
Их модель мировой революции заключалась прежде всего в том, что это будет союз социалистических государств.
So their idea, their model for the new revolution and new empire was that this would be the unity, the union of the socialist states.
Национальным окраинам России крайне привлекательной показалась идея, что теперь каждая нация будет получать свою государственность.
And the ethnic borderlands of the Russian Empire, they were attracted by the idea or by this proposition that all the ethnic groups, all the ethnic territories will have their own statehood.
Разумеется, это была иллюзия государственности, но это был новый тип государства, который приходил на смену царской России.
So this was an illusion, in fact, but it was still a new idea of a statehood which replaced the idea of Tsarist state.
Ну и, разумеется, речь идет о том, что все это делалось насильственными методами.
And of course, we have to bear in mind that this all was achieved using violence, but violent methods.
Нелегитимно взяв власть, большевики заботились только о том, чтобы ее удержать. И для них, в данном случае, исторические примеры французской революции и парижской коммуны были просто хрестоматийными.
So the Bolsheviks who took over the power without legitimate methods, without legitimate background, they were putting the focus on keeping the power, and they were inspired. They took example of the French Revolution, which they studied.
Любая революция ничего не стоит, если не может защищаться, говорил Ленин.
So, as Lenin said, no revolution is worth of anything if it cannot protect itself.
И в удержании власти и в увеличении насилия большевики достигли просто, я бы сказал, в кавычках, выдающихся результатов жестокости.
And with this goal in mind of keeping the power and raising the level of violence, the Bolsheviks, they reached the unprecedented, unseen levels of violence, something which hasn't been imagined and seen before.
И чем дальше шли социальные преобразования общества, тем, естественно, было больше сопротивления большевикам.
And the deeper the social reconstruction of the society was, it produced the more intense counteraction to the socialist Bolshevik government.
Ключевое слово для описания большевистского режима – это, конечно же, диктатура.
So the key word to describe the Bolshevik regime is dictatorship.
Но это не диктатура пролетариата, как об этом пропагандистски говорили большевики. Это, конечно же, была диктатура нового нарождающегося класса управленцев с партийными билетами.
But instead, it wasn't the dictatorship of the proletariat, the way the Bolsheviks wanted to present itself. It was a dictatorship of a new class, which was the new managing ruling class, the party members.
Интересно, что лидеры большевиков никогда не играли в так называемые, хотя бы даже для фасада, для украшения, демократические лозунги.
So it is very interesting, worth mentioning that Bolshevik leaders, they never pretended or wanted to play in the democratic slogans. They didn't play with them at all.
Они декларировали и упивались именно своим антидемократизмом.
So they actually were bragging about and they were happy with their anti-democratic inclines.
В этом был тоже свой пафос, пафос большевистской диктатуры. Дзержинский так и говорил: мы никогда не были кретинами демократизма.
So it has its own pathos, the pathos of Bolshevik dictatorship. And as Dzerzhinsky used to say, we have never been the cretins of democracy, democratic actions.
Когда Ленина спросили, почему позакрывали все демократические газеты, он ответил: мы не идиоты, чтобы кончать жизнь самоубийством.
So when Lenin was asked why did they close down all the democratic newspapers in the country, the Lenin's answer was, we are not idiots to commit suicide.
И в этом смысле большевистская диктатура, которая опиралась на насилие, она же, кроме того, опиралась и еще на одну абсолютно антигуманную идею, идею принудительного труда.
And Bolshevik dictatorship, which was based on violence, the other foundation idea of this dictatorship was the forced labor.
Самое интересное, что те люди, которые часто говорят о том, что вот большевики, они просто сделали что-то не то, что-то противное коммунистической теории, на самом деле заблуждаются. Все, что сделали большевики, это уже было записано в манифесте коммунистической партии.
And there are many people still who continue saying that Bolshevik, they just made a mistake or made an error and they did something against the communist doctrine. But they actually are mistaken themselves because everything which Bolsheviks did, it was written down in the Bolshevik ideological documents. They only implemented that.
Они даже не пошли так далеко, как там сказано. Они, например, не отменили право наследования, а Маркс и Энгельс говорили о серьезных и радикальных преобразованиях человеческого общества. Большевики даже не смогли достичь этого, я бы сказал, идеала, который был у Маркса и Энгельса.
To the contrary, Bolsheviks actually haven't done everything which Marx was asking for. For instance, the Bolshevik regime, they didn't abolish the inheritance rights, inheritance law, and Marx was saying about that. So basically, Bolshevik government took only half of the steps which were in mind.
И еще пару слов относительно трех фаз развития российской имперской идеи.
And also, I would like to add a few words about three phases of Russian imperial idea development.
Действительно, то государство, которое было создано большевиками, оно было государством, конечно, нового типа.
So first it was mentioned that the state which was created by the Bolsheviks, it was a new kind, new type of the state.
И вот эта идея псевдогосударственности наций, она действительно какое-то время выглядела достаточно привлекательно.
And this idea of a false statehood of the nations or ethnic groups, it was very attractive and looked very plausible for some time.
Но никто не собирался позволять нациям реализовывать свою государственность и выходить, например, уже из состава империи, Советской империи.
But nobody was going and nobody wanted to let the nations to implement their statehood and their state rights and, for instance, come out of the empire to become a truly independent nation.
Советская система держалась не только на насилии, но и на принудительном труде.
Soviet system was based not only on the violence, as was mentioned, but also on the forced labor.
И вершина этой новой советской государственности, новой советской государственной имперской идеи, конечно же, была при Сталине.
So the peak of this idea of new statehood, this idea reached its peak under the Stalin's rules.
Но советская нация, как союз наций, не состоялась. это тоже был фейк, исторический фейк.
And also worth mentioning that Soviet Union as a union of nations wasn't a success, it wasn't a true union of nations, it was also a false idea.
И сегодня мы видим реинкарнацию этих идей, но уже в виде новой российской имперской идеи, которая, конечно же, теперь зиждется исключительно на национальных или практически нацистских представлениях о том, каким должно быть государство. И это, к сожалению, тот печальный итог 1917 года, который мы видим сегодня.
And now we can see a new edition or reincarnation of Russian imperial idea, which this time is based on ultra-nationalist or maybe even Nazi ideas. And in some way, this is still a result of what has happened in 1917.
Thank you very much for those important remarks of how the flattering illusion of a new empire was presented and then achieved by violent and anti-democratic means. Marcel van Herpen, please.
Yes, I did only see the last minute of the film, so I don't want to make the film, but I was impressed. I have another take on the problem. It is how the Kremlin at this moment is reinterpreting the Great October Revolution. When one visited the Soviet Union in the 1980s, the October Revolution was still everywhere. There were monuments, there were parades, there were commemorations, and when people spoke about the revolution, it was never simply about the October Revolution, but about the Velikaya Oktyabrskaya Socialistическая Revoluция, the Great Socialist October Revolution. The revolution was great. Russians were proud of their revolution, and their pride even put the French in the shadow, because these never called their revolution great. In France, the adjective great was reserved for Napoleon's Grande Armée, the great army which, by the way, was defeated by the Russians near the river Berezina. During the whole Soviet epoch, beginning in the year 1918, 7 November was an official holiday. However, it was only in the 1930s, under Stalin, that it was called the Day of the Great Socialist October Revolution. Under Stalin, it became an institutionalized celebration with parades of workers and Stalin himself, who, on the Red Square, attended the military parade on the tribune on top of Lenin's mausoleum. The Russian population had 2 free days, not only 7 November, but also 8 November. This continued until 1991. On 7 November 1991, after the August coup d'etat, it was the first time that there was no official celebration. In Yeltsin's Russia, it became a problem. What should be done with the day of the Great October Revolution in a country which was in the process of decommunization, rejecting the heritage of the Bolshevik October Revolution? Yeltsin came up with a solution. On 13 March 1995, he signed a federal law called On the Days of the Military Glory of Russia, in which 7 November became the day of the liberation of Moscow. Liberation of Moscow. Yes, it was commemorating the defeat of Poland in 1612. 7 November no longer celebrated internationalist socialism. The emphasis switched to patriotism and national pride. 1 year later, on 7 November 1996, Yeltsin changed the name of the celebration in an ukaz, and the new name became Day of Harmony and Reconciliation, Dien Saglasya I Primirienie. We see here the new spin Yeltsin wanted to give to the 7 November celebration, adding national unity to national glory. Now we get 2017. 2017 was the year of the truth, because it was 100 years ago that the revolution took place, and foreign observers were curious how the Kremlin would react. Would the Russian leadership try to save the Russian Revolution by a low-profile commemoration, celebrating the few achievements which eventually could be attributed to the revolution, or would the Kremlin forget this date, preferring not to offer the still existing Communist Party of the Russian Federation an opportunity to benefit from such an event. Even more so because some months later, in March 2018, the presidential election would take place. Soon became clear that the second option was chosen. Before and during the date of the commemoration, a deep silence reigned in the Kremlin. The revolution was over. The revolution seemed to have definitively disappeared. However, can you let a historical event disappear by simply ignoring it? Stalin had the habit of clipping party leaders from photographs and eliminating disgraced comrades from history books, mostly after having eliminated them physically. But this method can no longer be used today. So what could the Kremlin do? Obviously, what the Kremlin needed was a reinterpretation. A reinterpretation, but how? Reinterpretations, as a rule, is a task assigned to historians. Historians are the high priests of historical truth. However, in Russia, this does not mean that they cannot change the historical truth if this is deemed necessary by the leaders in the Kremlin. In Russia, they can, in the same way as the Pope of Rome can proclaim a new article of faith. So, what is the new truth? That's the big question. On December 27, 2016, so before the 100 years commemoration, Serhii Narishkin, who is today the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, but at that time Speaker of the State Duma, but who is also the head, very interesting, of the Russian Historical Society, came together with the members of the Presidium of the Historical Society to discuss the coming anniversary. During this meeting, Nikita PETROV, director of the Institute of Russian History, remarked that, I quote, "In our society exist very different interpretations of the revolution, from a locomotive of history to an absolute evil. It was clear that the revolution had become a highly sensitive subject. Petrov repeated Putin's wish to avoid confrontations. 1 year later, when the fatal date approached, there were organized several conferences. However, Mikhail Demurin, a journalist of the news agency Regnum, complained that, I quote, "The most important media publish almost nothing about these conferences," adding that the leitmotif of the official and semi-official comments on the October Revolution is, unfortunately, that it would have been better if it would not have taken place. At the end of November 2017, after the fatal date had passed, the Russian Historical Society organized a new event, this time together with the Russian Academy of Sciences, and the subject of this conference was the results of the revolution of 1917. Also, this conference took place in great silence. Of course, everyone was very curious what this conference would present as the official results of the October Revolution. After the event, one could read on the website of the Russian Historical Society the following text, I quote, "Under the aegis of the Russian Historical Society has been elaborated a new educational, historical, cultural standard and offered a new guideline for history school books. The scientists proposed to view the October Revolution not as an isolated event, but as a chain of interrelated events, which included the Tsar's abdication from the throne, the events of February and October 1917, the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, and the Civil War. In this way, for the first time appeared the term the Great Russian Revolution 1917-1922. The term great means in the first place the scale of its consequences. They had a global impact." End of the quote. This seemed a brilliant move. The historians did neither praise the October Revolution nor condemn it, but made it a part of a larger historical process, which included the February Revolution and the Civil War. Lenin, still in his mausoleum on the Red Square, would be turning in his glass cage, hearing that his revolution had become a sub-chapter of the February Revolution. Also, the way in which the adjective great was saved was a stroke of genius, no longer referring to the supposed heroism and courage of the communist revolutionaries, but only to the scale of the consequences. Neither the communists nor the anti-communists could feel offended. In the Russian press, there was much speculation about the question, and if the October Revolution would not have taken place. The answers were interesting. Pyotr Tolstoy, deputy speaker of the Duma and a descendant of the writer, said that without the revolution, Russia would have won the First World War, would have had a seat at the table of the victors, and with their approval would have received, I quote, the Bosporus, the Dardanelles, and Constantinople. However, Vyacheslav Nikonov, the grandson of Molotov, Stalin's Minister of Foreign Affairs, defended the October Revolution, arguing that it was thanks to the October Revolution that Putin, for the first time in history, became one of the superpowers. Just 1 minute. Putin himself, because that's interesting, went still further, touting the revolution's supposed positive consequences, not in Russia, but abroad. I quote, "Many Western achievements," said Putin, "of the 20th century were the answer to the challenge of the USSR, the increase in the standard of living, the formation of a powerful middle class, the reform of the labor market and of social security, the expansion of education and human rights protection, including women's and minorities' rights, the end of racial segregation, which some decennia ago still was a shameful practice in many countries, including the USA. Putin's list of the October Revolution's supposed benefits is almost endless. If you believe him, the October Revolution was a driving force in the realization of Roosevelt's New Deal, President Johnson's Great Society, civil rights movements, women's liberations, and the establishment of the welfare state. One cannot deny that the existence of the USSR functioned as a bogeyman for Western politicians and made them more willing to conduct reforms. However, to present the October Revolution, which brought so much suffering to the Russian population, as a present to the West, resembles to praise hell, because its existence would be an incentive for people to live a decent life and to strive to go to heaven. Okay, we'll leave it to us.
Thank you very much for bringing us right up to date, as the title of this debate is, 100 years on. Our panelists now have the opportunity to respond to some of the things that we said. Yes, Gayle.
Mine is actually to Nikita, and it's concerning nationalism, which I think is obviously going to come up in the next few days, I would imagine. And I would say, you said that the Bolshevik policy on the nations and nationalism was attractive to the other nations. I think you have to remember and put that into the context of the war that was being fought at the time. Because, firstly, the Bolshevik policy on the nationalities, why does a Marxist party have a policy on the nationalities, has become the biggest question. It was done in the context of what happened over the next few years. They didn't really have anything in 1917 to attract anybody. And basically it becomes a policy, obviously under the Commissar of Nationalities, Joseph Stalin, and the party itself argues about it over the next few years. And I say it's done in the context of the World War because, of course, the backer of many of the nations that were trying to separate themselves, Finland, Ukraine, also Georgia, would be Germany. And, of course, that would collapse later on. And then, of course, for many of them, the point is, where else do they go? For example, Armenia. Where is it going to go? It can't look, there's the Ottoman Empire, it's collapsing, and it would never go there. It wouldn't begin to go there. It doesn't, Germany won't support it. And then when they go to Versailles, and they all turn up at Versailles, the new state of Poland is recognized, but the Ukraine isn't. The Armenians are there trying to get a hearing, the Georgians are there trying to get a hearing, and Versailles completely rejects. So basically the support from outside is non-existent. Then later on, so you have other, again, with peace treaties, it comes on, Brest-Litovsk. In a way, Ukraine is recognized there, but then that very quickly collapses again anyway. And then, let's have a look. Then basically you have Riga in 1921. None of these things actually sort anything out. So I suppose my point here is that there's nothing really, they've got nowhere else to go. So we talk about the nationalities issue, but we always tend to forget that it's done in the context of the World War. And so that was my one point. Can I make a second point? Is that okay? My second point is the idea of Lenin as a heroic figure. And I suppose what was very interesting is looking at the results of questionnaires, which the Levada Institute does year after year, on who was the greatest Russian. And of course, in 1992, I think it was, when it was called something else, but of course, Lenin, I think, came second. When you look after, basically, say, from last year, the year before that, Lenin's not there anymore. He's no longer a hero at all. And of course, as is we're constantly reminded, that of course that Stalin always ranks very, very, very high at the top. And so I would question the idea of Lenin as a hero in the same way that basically the actual revolution has become, the revolutionary year of 1917 has become a tricky subject. And that was actually, to Michel. Okay.
Thank you. Nikita Petrov, would you like to reply briefly? I've received a message that we must finish by 1935.
Я, конечно, не мог много развивать тему большевики и национальный вопрос, потому что на это не было времени, но я скажу, конечно, был процесс распада царской империи и становление государственной самостоятельности наций, и была, я бы сказал, попытка большевиков этим процессом овладеть.
So I couldn't develop this topic of nationalities and national questions due to the lack of time, but of course we have to say that there was this collapse of Russian Empire and all those national movements, and there was the attempts of the communists to take over this process, to manage it somehow.
Они ведь постепенно пришли к этой идее. Они ничего не могли сделать с Финляндией и Польшей.
So the communists, they came to this idea gradually, step by step. They couldn't do anything about Finland or Poland.
Но когда они набирались сил, они начинали просто захватнические походы, как против Закавказья, например.
But when the power or the forces of the communists grew, they just started the wars, how they do to Transcaucasian republics.
И был Ленин, который был более радикален, и Сталин, который занимался национальным вопросом, и Солженицын полагал, что не нужны союзные республики, а должны быть автономии.
So, and there were a few key figures. There was Lenin, who was quite a radical, had quite radical views. There was Stalin, who managed the national policies question, and there was Solzhenitsyn, who didn't think there had to be any even semi-independent or seemingly independent state. They had to be autonomous republics.
За что сегодня Кремль не любит Ленина? Он внедрил этот принцип национальной государственности, которая, естественно, была той самой, я бы сказал, проблемой, которая разрушила Советский Союз в итоге.
And that is the reason why Kremlin nowadays doesn't love Lenin, because Lenin was the person who introduced this idea of national statehood, even if it wasn't true, because this national statehood, this was something which led to the collapse of the USSR later on.
Чего сегодня не понимает Кремль? Что у Кремля нет историзма во взгляде. Надо понимать, что только на таких принципах можно было тогда строить империю. Другие принципы уже не работали.
And what has to be said that Kremlin nowadays, they lack this historical analysis or historical understanding. They cannot see that back then it was the only principle on which this territory, this country could have been managed or led.
И Кремль, конечно же, не понимает, что этот принцип недолговременный, он не мог долго позволить существовать империи.
And also what people in Kremlin don't understand is that this principle of those semi-statehood for national groups, it wasn't supposed or couldn't have allowed this empire to last longer, that it was temporary solution anyway.
Марсель дал блестящий анализ, я уже обращаюсь к Марселю, который просто показывает полную импотенцию сегодняшней российской исторической науки, не способной объяснить 17-й год.
And Marcel van Harpen here, he gave a very brilliant analysis which says that, presents that Russian historical science now is simply incapable of explaining and analyzing the 1917.
Российская историческая наука вновь идеологизирована, поэтому не способна отвечать честно на многие исторические вопросы.
So Russian historians, Russian historical studies are ruled by ideology now. That's why the historians are incapable of answering important questions now.
Serhii, PLOKHII.
I know that we have very little time, so few very short comments. First of all, about nationalities, yeah, I absolutely agree. It's the war that puts nationality question on the Bolshevik agenda and social democratic agenda in general, but also the February Revolution of 1917. What we see is really after March, April, May, it's what in 1990 became known as Parad Suverenitetov. It's Georgia, it's Ukraine, we never mentioned Poland as part of that story, which is a big part of the story of the quote-unquote Russian Revolution. So February is another factor that I would add to that. And on Lenin as a hero, and that probably connects, my comment is in general to what we discuss here. We have a paradox, a very interesting paradox. Lenin is not a hero in Russia anymore, and is not a hero in Ukraine. In Ukraine, you see that really the important part of that revolution, of the third revolution, is demolition of the monuments to Lenin. In Russia, most of the monuments, my understanding is they're still there. So there is, revolution is not discussed. Lenin is not a hero. Stalin is winning popularity contests, but the monuments are still to Lenin. And again, that is a situation that probably can last for a long period of time. It lasted now for more than 25 years. But it is a paradox, and sooner or later, the society would have to somehow come to terms with this new understanding or lack of understanding of the revolution, and who was a hero and who was a villain in that story.
Marcel van Herpen.
I have a question to Gayle, because you were talking about the Congress of Vienna, but we should have had a Congress of Vienna in 1991 after the demise of the Soviet Union. Well, after a big war, there is always some kind of an international big conference, that's true. The end of the Cold War was in fact an internal affair in the Soviet Union. It was collapsing the system, but it was not after a real war. The Cold War was not a real war. It's interesting that from the Russian side, Putin's side, and Medvedev's side, always this argument has been put forward that there has not been a post-Cold War international order created. And then came in 2008 Medvedev, who was then president at interim, with his idea for a pan-European security pact in that time, which was much discussed in 2008. It was a very interesting thing because he wanted to bring NATO and the OSCE under the pan-European security pact, of which Russia was a member, which would mean that Russia would have a veto power over NATO. So that's why NATO said, no, never. But it was still, from the Russian side, it was always said, well, we have no real end stage, no, there is nothing. Well, the OSCE, of course, is one of these international fora for East and West cooperation. But it is one of the points of discussion.
Now, given that we have only 8 minutes left, I would like as many people as possible from the floor to be able to say something. But I would ask you to keep your questions or comments to no more than 30 seconds each, please. And I will then ask the panelists, when they respond, to keep their answers equally succinct.
impossible to build a nation. Mr. Lenin says it is impossible to build a nation state in Russia. It is impossible to build a nation state in Russia because Russia has always been built from top to the bottom, not from the bottom to the top. Do you agree to this point or not? And second question is to Professor LONERGAN. So, do you agree to the statement that Russian revolutions are the competition of hierarchies of power? And if a leader can build up a hierarchy of power which can overpower the ancient regime, then this leader wins the revolution. Thank you.
We'll take the answers together at the end. The next question, well, I think, was over there. The hand has gone down again. There's one over there.
Apologize for my English. I'd like to ask, because now many historians say many things about Lenin, but is almost all the time created as a dictator. And I'd like to ask, because many historians, many people forget that he also made 8 hours day of work, for example, free education, free and public health care, the declaration of nations of Russia, I think something like that, and created the, and led the other nations to create their own countries, for example, Poland, or that he changed his politics, his political views, Marxist views. He changed the new economic politics and left the ideas. So I'd like to ask why these things are many, how to say, in many situations are forgotten, and why the history is now used by politics for their own.
Right. Thank you. We can take another question. No? Oh, one more at the back.
How did the revolution affect the political thought of Putin today, and how this is manifesting in the daily politics of Russia today, in terms of external relations? So the political thought, again. Yeah, but there's something.
Right, thank you very much. Yes, I think we can now ask the panelists to respond to whichever questions they feel are addressed to them, in which they have something to say. Perhaps we can go again in the same order that we started with.
Okay. Mike, you asked me one of those questions you think, oh dear, I have to think about this one. And I'll probably come up with a proper answer. Sorry, to this. And I'll probably come up with a correct answer in about 3 hours' time, I've no doubt. But my thinking, the idea of hierarchies of power, revolutions, for me, I've always seen, I mean, revolutions is a total vacuum of power. There's nothing left. Everything collapses. And then it's a question of whoever decides to grab power. And this is why I suppose that even the language that for example, is used, you know, it's like Bolsheviki skhvatili vlast. So the idea of like they grab, they grasp, or whatever. For me, it really is it's a total vacuum that kind of you're being sucked into. And in 1917, and I think this comes across in the film, even when Lenin was being laughed at as a minority, he actually stands up and, like they say in this kind of garbled speech, he stands up and says, "We are the party that will take power." And everybody laughs at him. But then later on, you know, he comes back, he presents his April thesis. Everybody, his own wife, worries for his mental health. And then come that sort of final part in October, and this is, again, what I felt didn't so much come out in the film, is this was a party that disagreed amongst itself, and violently disagreed amongst itself. It would do the next year over Brest-Litovsk, but there was no agreement. You mentioned that 2 people were against it, but there was a much bigger debate going on before that. about the abandonment of the Soviets, all power to the Soviets. Well, that's gone, as Lenin demanded, but then Lenin is the person who brings it all through. And though we don't like the kind of like the big man or the great man theory of history, there are events where you have to sit and think that it's seemingly this person pushing it through is determined to grab power into his own hands, not into his hands, into the party's hands. And so that's what I would say. Hierarchies of power, there is nothing. And when there's nothing, it's a question of what you can manage to create out of it. And I wasn't sure if I understood the young man's sort of comment over there about the freedom of nations that was given, the freedom to Poland. I mean, I think most people would agree that, I mean, maybe I misunderstood you, but yeah, it was social achievements, but also the freedom that was given to Poland. I mean, Polish now, I mean, it was fought for. It was fought for with different aims. The Poland that came about later on and after the Second World War, I don't know, I mean, can you sit there and go on about, it's a constant thing, of course, for people talking from the former Soviet Union, you know, we didn't, you know, we had free healthcare, we had whatever. I can't really say that, it would be better off, I'm sure, from Nikita to make a comment upon this, whether you can balance that against, for example, I mean, the attack upon anybody of a Polish nationality, for example, under Stalin, the movement of peoples, the exile of entire peoples, just because of the constant threat, supposedly. So I don't know. It's a balance. If you, I mean, a Georgian friend of mine said that, you know, you threw out the baby with the bathwater. I suspect that Nikita will have far more to say on that than me, anyway.
I'm afraid he won't have time to say far more than that. But Serhii, PLOKHII.
Thank you. Follow on what Gayle just said with regards to the social change and why Lenin is not credited for that. Well, I think one of the answers is in the documentary that we just saw, and I was struck by the amount of slogans among these people who are manifesting, defending what we would today call gender rights, and that about women's movement. And that's, in many ways, that's something that comes to the fruition in 1920s. And those manifestations had zero to do with Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, 2 zeros to do with the Bolshevik Party and with the revolution that took place, Bolshevik Revolution. But it was part of the revolution as a whole that started without Lenin or maybe against Lenin. So that is one of the reasons why there is no particularly good point of linking the Bolshevik takeover, not just disregard of democracy, but establishment of totalitarian regime that killed millions of people, with the social change that basically they had, the wave that they had to drive to a degree or try to control. So but that is one of the reasons, but again, overall I agree with Gayle on this balance of things.
Thank you. Nikita PETROV.
Ну, относительно социального государства могу сказать, что без свободы это социальное государство является лагерем. Любой концентрационный и трудовой лагерь есть мини-социальное государство. Именно таким государством в больших масштабах был Советский Союз.
There are some people. Okay, so basically without freedoms, the social statehood is just a concentration camp. All the concentration or labor, forced labor camps are also mini social states in a way.
Вы обязаны трудиться, а вас будут за это кормить.
So basically you have to work and you will be fed for that.
I'm not agree with Dugin. I can explain. But in this point, in general, Dugin he's some kind of Euro-Asian theory fascist or something like that. But in this case, he right, it's impossible to create the national state in Russia because Russia now have the same problem that have the Soviet Union in last period of its existence. National tensions, what's volume of freedom or national feelings Kremlin can allow to Tataria, for instance. Last year it was not prolonged. You know that some kind of special act about the Tatarian national state and something like that. It's a great problem in Russia in future. And as for Putin, he have the basic education during the Soviet ideological system. That is why, from one hand, he admire of the Soviet Empire. From other hand, he recognized that now it's necessary to do something with the crash of this empire. And that is why this nostalgia feelings about the empire and powerful state and a revenge and some kind of aggressive politics against the neighbors of modern Russia.
Thank you. Marcel van Herpen, a very brief last word, please.
Well, Putin is always proud to say that he's not a racist, and he cannot be a racist because 20% of the population is not Russian in the Russian Federation. If you look to Putin's imperialism, it's interesting. What he wants to rebuild is not the old Soviet Union. It's also he tells himself, I don't want to restore the old... Sorry? Oh, sorry. I do not want to restore the old Soviet Union. But what he wants is to restore the Slavic kernel, the Slavic core of the Soviet Union. He wants Belarus. He has made a proposal to Belarus that it could become about seven provinces of the Russian Federation. His whole policy and aggression in Ukraine is a fact because he wants Ukraine to be a full part of the Russian Federation and not only Donbass. So I think at this moment Putin will come back. It will be his last presidency. It will be his last chance to be Vladimir the Great of the 21st century and to gather the lands that are necessary for the Russian Federation. And I think that we can expect in this moment after he is re-elected, we can expect a new aggression against Ukraine. This is for him very important. It is a real obsession.
Well, that certainly sets us up for the conference that is to come. I'd like to... It seems as though the debate has only just started. We've had an embarrassment of riches. But we must finish. There is a reception in the foyer to which everyone's warmly invited. So to finish, a round of applause, please, for Michel DOBRY and for our four panelists.
Okay. What do we do?
Okay.
Will somebody be...
You give a hint.
No problem.
I give a hint. Come on.
Just push me out the door.